Did you ever get blamed for something you didn't do, just because you were easy to blame?
When people talk about family vacations, they usually picture laughter, relaxation, maybe a chance to finally step away from the stress of daily life and remember what it feels like to breathe without the weight of responsibility pressing down on their chest. But for me, that concept has always existed like some distant fantasy, a thing I knew about only through movies, television, and the stories of other people, because in my family, I was never the one who got invited to escape. I was always the one who stayed behind to hold things together, which is exactly the excuse they used this time when they left me home for a luxury trip and told me I didn't need a break. The words weren't shouted, they weren't cruel in tone, but they carried a sting sharper than if someone had spit them in my face, because they were delivered so casually, as though they had been rehearsed. As though everyone else had already agreed on the script and my role in it. My mother had leaned across the counter one evening and told me that I was doing fine, that I was strong enough and didn't really need a vacation. And she said it with that smile that made it sound like a compliment, but felt more like a slap. And then my sister chimed in about how the kids needed the beach, how Dad needed to relax, how she herself had been through so much. And they all talked over each other, while I stood there realizing I was the only one not accounted for in the plan. I remember laughing, not because it was funny, but because it was the only thing I could do to keep my voice steady, and I told them that of course I understood, that it was fine, that I'd stay behind and take care of things just like I always had. And the second those words left my mouth, I knew I had signed off on my own erasure yet again, reinforcing the role they loved me in, the dependable daughter, the one who didn't complain, who didn't demand anything, who let everyone else shine while she quietly disappeared into the background. The day they left, the house felt like a movie set after the actors had gone, everything too quiet, too staged, with the luggage wheels rolling across the driveway, their voices fading into laughter as they piled into the car. And I stood at the window thinking about how ridiculous it was that, even after decades of being sidelined, I still expected them to maybe turn back, maybe shout that there was space in the car, that it was all some test. But the taillights disappeared down the street and the silence swallowed me whole. At first, I did what I always do. I told myself it didn't matter, that I preferred the quiet anyway, that I had work to do, bills to organize, projects around the house I could finally get to without interruption. But then my phone started buzzing with photos they sent to each other in the group chat. Pictures of poolside cocktails, dinner tables full of food, smiling faces against the backdrop of ocean waves, and I wasn't even tagged. I wasn't even a thought in the captions. I was just the ghost they had left to water the plants and collect the mail while they lived out the version of family life that apparently didn't require me to exist. I lay awake that first night replaying the conversation when my mother said I didn't need a break, and I realized she wasn't wrong in the way she thought she was, because it wasn't that I didn't need a break, it was that I needed something much bigger, something final. Something that wouldn't be undone by an apology or a half-hearted invitation to come next time, because this wasn't about a trip, it was about the years of being dismissed, ignored, and treated like the safety net instead of a person with needs, and I finally admitted to myself that if I kept waiting for them to notice me, I would wait forever. The thought should have scared me, but instead it settled over me like a strange kind of calm, because I could see the truth for once without making excuses for them. I wasn't part of their world, I was a convenience, a placeholder. Someone they could lean on when it suited them, but never someone worth celebrating or investing in, and the moment I accepted that, a new idea began to take shape inside me, quiet at first, but growing louder with each passing hour they spent on that trip. I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I didn't call them begging for acknowledgement, because deep down I understood that no performance on my part would suddenly make them see me differently. Instead, I started writing lists, not of chores or errands like I usually did, but of everything I had given to them, everything I had covered for, all the responsibilities I had carried without thanks, and as the list grew, it became harder to ignore the question forming in my mind. If I had already been living like I didn't exist in their lives, then what would really change if I simply stopped existing to them altogether? By the third night, when their messages had slowed down and I had stopped even opening the group chat, I knew the answer, and it didn't feel dramatic or emotional. It felt logical, almost overdue. Because what they had given me was freedom disguised as cruelty, the kind of freedom that comes when you realize no one is holding on to you and you're no longer obligated to hold on to them. I looked around the house that had never really felt like mine, filled with their noise and their presence, and I thought, fine, let them come back to their perfect family life. Let them walk through the door after their vacation, because by the time they set their suitcases down, I would already be gone, and they would finally know what it felt like to live in a home where I no longer existed. And for the first time in years, maybe my whole life, that thought didn't terrify me, it thrilled me. The first morning without them, I woke up to a flood of photos in the family thread that I was not even tagged in, sunburned smiles and overfilled plates and captions about how everyone finally felt human again. And while I stared at the screen with that old ache pressing into my chest, I realized I was watching footage from a world I had maintained but never been allowed to occupy, a world that ran on reservations I made, bills I paid, reminders I sent, favors I delivered, and schedules I protected, and that thought landed with a kind of quiet authority that pushed me out of bed, because once you admit that you have been treating your own backbone like a public utility, you either keep doing it forever or you shut the service down. I made coffee and opened a notebook, not for journaling and not for feelings, but for inventory, because there is a particular kind of dignity that returns the moment you stop asking whether you are overreacting and start writing down what you actually do. So I wrote a long line that began with the family phone plan that lived under my name because I had the credit and the patience to wrangle the carrier, and I added the streaming services that I signed up for during their free trials and then kept paying for because the kids would cry if the cartoon disappeared, and I added the home internet that had been auto-charged to my card after the first outage when everyone screamed that work could not stop. And I added the car insurance that I had bundled with mine to lower their rates, and I added the joint emergency account that had started as a cushion during a hard year and stayed open because it was easier than arguing. And I added the little things that do not look like much but bleed you over time, like the subscriptions for recipe kits and meal deliveries that were always for the family, even though the family very often meant everyone but me. I kept writing, letting the names pile up, and with each line I felt my posture change. Not in some dramatic cinematic way, but in the simple relief that comes when you put numbers into sentences and see a pattern that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with habit. And while my phone kept chiming with their vacation joy, I opened every account, one by one, and checked ownership, checked terms, checked how to end things cleanly without drama, because revenge dressed up as generosity is the sweetest kind, and the most honest version of generosity I could offer at that moment was to withdraw what belonged to me and return to them the responsibility they had refused for years. I started with the easiest cut, the streaming accounts stacked like plates in a sink, all of them attached to my email and my payment method. And I paused only long enough to feel the old guilt twitch in my stomach before I reminded myself that I was not canceling anything they could not replace with a few clicks and their own card, and I scheduled every plan to end the day after their return. Not out of cruelty, but out of a desire to stop the slow bleed on the exact day my patience had finally expired, and watching the confirmation emails arrive in neat little rows felt less like aggression and more like boundaries finally taking a shape I could point to. The phone plan took longer because I had to sit through the scripted friendliness of a representative who kept asking if I was sure, and I kept my voice calm while I ported my line to a solo account and removed my card as the backup funder for the remaining lines. And when the system asked whether I wanted to keep financial responsibility for the others or let them lapse at the end of the cycle unless someone else claimed them, I let the silence hang for a breath that stretched on forever and then I chose the option I had never allowed myself to choose, the one that put the cost of their convenience back in their hands, and the confirmation text came through like a bell I could finally hear. From there it became a rhythm that did not feel angry, just efficient, because I walked room to room and gathered my documents, the passport, the titles, the birth certificate, the stack of tax folders with receipts and letters and proof of what I had covered. And I slid everything into a plain envelope that I tucked into a bag I could lift without help, and I opened the laptop again and submitted a change of address to a small mailbox service across town, not because I wanted to vanish into shadows, but because I wanted their mailers, bills, and packages to stop using my doorstep like a sorting station, and the moment I clicked submit, I felt the first clean breath I had taken in years. All afternoon, I caught myself checking the thread and then closing it because I did not need another boomerang of resentment ruining the productive calm I had finally built. So instead, I made 2 more calls that mattered more than I had expected. One to the bank to split the so-called emergency account according to the exact deposits and transfers logged over the years, which meant I walked away with my share without a fight or a speech, and another to the utilities to remove my name as the guarantee on any service that was not actually mine, and I kept my tone courteous because I was not trying to scorch the earth. I was just stopping the practice of standing under everyone else's umbrella. By evening, I could feel the part of me that had always flinched waiting for someone to accuse me of being dramatic, selfish, cruel, or ungrateful, and I let her speak for a minute because I knew that voice had been trained by years of being useful. But then I answered her with a single thought that felt like a lock sliding into place, which was that there is nothing dramatic about returning borrowed weight to the people who dropped it on you, and there is nothing selfish about refusing to finance a version of family that does not include you unless you are holding the camera or the wallet. I sat at the kitchen table looking at the neat pile of confirmations and the empty space where the guilt usually lived, and I understood that these were only the first cuts and that the deeper work would come next. The work of removing my presence from the physical space and the daily patterns they assumed I would continue forever, but I also knew I did not need to race, because I had already taken the step that would make them feel, for the first time, the chill of my absence. And as I closed the laptop for the night, I scheduled one last action that would make it undeniable, a pickup request for a storage company to collect a set of labeled boxes that I would pack before dawn. And I stared at the confirmation window asking me to press confirm to lock the time, and I let the cursor hover until my heartbeat settled, and then I clicked, knowing that when their plane touched down and they tried to call me, the line would ring into a hollow they had built themselves, and the first thing they would feel when they walked through the door would be that something essential had shifted and would not be shifting back. By the time the storage truck pulled up at the curb just after sunrise, I had already been awake for hours, moving through the rooms with a steadiness that surprised me, folding my life into labeled boxes that were not sentimental trophies, but practical containers of what was actually mine, documents and books and the tools I used to earn my living. The small kitchen appliances I bought during the years when everyone assumed communal meant free and free meant mine, and as I taped each box I felt the old reflex to apologize rise like muscle memory before I pressed it back down with the reminder that removal is not cruelty when presence has been treated like inventory. It is simply the correction of a ledger that has been out of balance for too long. The driver did not ask questions beyond the inventory and the destination. And I was grateful for the neutrality, because neutrality is a relief when you have lived in a house where every decision passes through the filter of whether it will inconvenience someone who never once asked whether you were already bent double holding up their convenience. So we loaded the boxes and a few small pieces of furniture that were unquestionably mine, the desk I worked at and the chair I paid for and the narrow bookshelf that I assembled alone on a night when everyone was shouting about a sports game and no one noticed that I had quietly built a corner where my own things could live without being borrowed and never returned. And when the truck pulled away, I stood in the quiet and listened to the sound of a home turning into a shell that no longer fit me. I opened my laptop and began the part that felt both surgical and strangely gentle, the digital extraction that would leave behind no mess and no accusation, only a series of politely closed doors. So I downloaded a copy of the shared photo library that I had built over years because I was the one who cared enough to tag and organize and back up, and I moved my contributions to a private archive while leaving their pictures intact. Then I downgraded the storage plan that I had been funding on my card and transferred ownership of the folder structure to my mother's email with a clear note that the billing would stop at the end of the cycle unless someone else added a payment method. And I felt that familiar tug toward guilt right up until I remembered the vacation album they had built in real time without inviting me into the frame, and the tug loosened like a knot finally learning it did not have to hold. From there I worked through the long queue of accounts with care that was almost ceremonial, changing the recovery addresses on anything that was mine and removing myself as the emergency contact on anything that was not. Confirming with my employer that payroll would land in the new bank I had opened the day before. Setting up a new phone number with a quiet area code and enabling two-factor authentication, so the next time someone in the family tried to fix a problem by guessing my security answers, they would meet a locked door and a reminder that adulthood does not include the right to use another person as a universal spare key. And I left a forwarding rule in my old inbox that would pass along only professional messages while archiving family chatter in a folder I would not check, because starvation is the only cure for an appetite that has eaten the better part of your life. I gathered the last few items that mattered, the small box of letters from a former boss who believed in me when no one at home did, and the legal files that proved what I had covered and what I had owned, and I placed on the kitchen table a short, unsentimental envelope addressed to the household with my keys inside and a single sentence that would not suit them or attack them, but would tell the truth in the cleanest way I knew how, that I was stepping out of the position they had kept me in, and into a life where my name was not the backup plan, and that if they wanted what I had managed, they could manage it themselves or go without, and I sealed the envelope without a flourish, because I was not staging a scene, I was exiting a system. When the locksmith arrived at the small apartment across town that I had signed for online, I watched him work with the calm that follows a storm in your head that finally spends itself. And when he left, I sat on the bare floor and mapped the next 48 hours in a way that made the logistics feel like an ally rather than a punishment. Arranging for a clean-out crew to collect the few remaining items in my old room that had no real owner and no use to me, scheduling a final sweep to ensure that nothing with my name on it remained in drawers or on shelves or in the hollow behind the washing machine where everyone tosses things they do not want to decide about. And sending certified letters to the car insurer and the utility providers and the medical office that had my number listed as the default contact for everyone, letters that said, in effect, that the default had changed and the habit had ended. I thought about leaving a longer explanation because that is what I have always done, novels of context and justification written to people who read only the parts that made them comfortable, and I decided that the single sentence with the keys was enough. Because explanations are just another kind of service when the audience has already decided not to understand you, and I decided that silence, backed by clean paperwork and cleared payments, was the most adult sound in the world, and that the first person to hear it should be me. As evening fell, I walked through the empty structure of the day and checked each boundary like a person testing a fence they have built by hand, tugging at the joints and pressing against the posts, and I recognized the old urge to soften the corners for their landing, to leave behind a guide or a cushion or a workaround that would make my departure easier on them, and I told that urge it could rest, because kindness that erases you is not kindness, it is self-erasure, and I have done enough. Disappearing for one lifetime. I turned off the lights in a house that felt suddenly honest in its emptiness, carried my bag to the car that was mine both on paper and in truth. And as I pulled away, I let the voicemail greeting on the old number roll to a simple message that said I was unavailable and would not be checking messages here, which was not a taunt but a boundary. And I knew that the next time their group thread lit up it would be with question marks and accusations and confusion, and that when their plane touched down and the ride home turned onto our street, they would expect the old choreography to hug them at the door, and instead they would step over their own threshold and meet the echo I had left in my place, an echo that would point them toward the kitchen table, where the envelope waited to tell them, in the fewest words possible, that the person who never needed a break had finally taken one they could not interrupt. They came home loud the way people do when the world has reassured them that they are central and safe, dragging glossy suitcases through the doorway and calling out for me like I might pop out of the pantry with a welcome home joke and a tray of something they would devour before mentioning calories. And in the quiet that answered back, they finally heard the sound I had been living with for years, the sound of a house that did not include me, because my room was a clean rectangle of carpet and paint with nothing to trip over. The bathroom drawers slid like empty shelves in a store that had closed. The coat hooks held only their clutter. And on the kitchen table lay a plain envelope with keys inside and a single sentence that did not plead or apologize and did not threaten either. It simply told the truth that I was done being the offstage crew for their show and that from now on they could handle their own lights and props and applause. The first reaction was predictable and almost tender in its familiarity, a chorus of indignant questions tossed into the group thread where I once poured daily solutions. Accusations dressed as concern about whether I was safe, followed by a quick pivot to whether I had lost my mind, then the guilt drumbeat about family not walking out on family. And when the call started, they met the blunt voicemail that said I was unavailable and not checking messages there, which they took as an act of war. When it was simply what it was, a boundary that did not need a speech to stand, and while they paced the hall and tried the old tricks, plugging my name into every app and account that once opened, because I had allowed it, the first little conveniences began to flicker out like lights in a building that has finally recognized a tenant has moved. They turned on the television to share highlights from the trip and hit the polite screen that asked for a payment method because the free ride had ended exactly when mine did, and they muttered about glitches until the other services stacked up behind the same request. The music access and the premium sports bundle and the movie subscription that used to hang on my email like a sign that said open at all hours, and when that frustration swelled, they reached for the supposed constants and found them suddenly conditional, because the home internet still hummed thanks to the grace period, but the account owner had changed and the billing window had closed unless someone added a card. The shared cloud folders popped up a message reminding them that ownership had been transferred and storage would shrink unless they paid. And the family phone plan delivered a neat notice on each device that new responsibility had been assigned and lines would require their own authorization at the end of the cycle. It was almost funny to imagine the moment when they thought to open the emergency account that had lived like a family myth, a bottomless cushion everyone could fall into because I was the one quietly refilling it in the background. And to watch their faces in my mind as the balance reflected exactly and only what belonged to them, my portion already moved with verifiable ledgers to support it, and the automatic transfers switched off with a timestamp that would hold up under any glare. And right beneath that tidy number sat the confirmation that the mortgage auto-pay drawing from that cushion had been canceled by its own rules when the funding source changed. Which was not a trap I had set, but a chain reaction that occurs when the person holding the safety net steps back and refuses to be the fabric. On the kitchen table, alongside the envelope with the keys, waited a thin stack of certified letters that did not snarl or rant. They simply notified and confirmed. The auto insurer acknowledging that my liability coverage no longer extended to drivers not on my policy. The utility providers confirming that my name was removed as guarantor and that continuation of service required updated authorization. The medical office acknowledging the change to emergency contacts so that midnight responsibility would no longer default to me, and the letter with the most voltage, which they opened last with a scoff that turned into static, came from the lender on my sister's home loan. A polite document explaining that a formal request for release of the cosigner had been filed and preliminarily approved pending her independent requalification, a step allowed under the original terms after a sufficient history of on-time payments, and that unless she completed the re-underwriting within a short window, she would need to designate a new guarantor or accept a revised structure with conditions spelled out in a language that makes most people feel suddenly small. I did not need to be there to hear the arguments swell and collapse under the weight of their own history, because I know the soundtrack of that house by heart, how concern gets used like a hairbrush to smooth down the parts that rebel, how blame vaults from person to person until it lands back in my lap, except this time there was no lap to catch it and no familiar target to absorb the impact, only a series of closed circles that each pointed to their own names and asked for something simple and adult. A card on file, a signature, evidence of income, a direct contact number for emergencies that was not mine. Someone tried one last angle, the sentimental message about how families do not keep score and how I should have talked to them instead of ambushing them with paperwork. And I let that roll across the quiet in my new place like weather passing over a building that no longer leaks, because I had talked for years in a language they refused to learn. And when talking becomes unpaid translation, the only way to be heard is to stop translating, to let systems speak in their neutral syntax, and if that sounded cold to them, then maybe the temperature had always been this low, and I had finally stopped burning myself to keep the room warm. Later, as night came down on their end and the thread shifted from outrage to strategy to that stunned hush people fall into when they realize a structure was being carried by a person they dismissed, a photo popped up from the kitchen I used to clean. The envelope with the keys sitting under the lender's letter like a paperweight, and a single line from my mother that could have been a plea or a statement or both asked whether I understood what I was doing to the family, and I stared at that sentence for a long breath that felt like a lifetime, and then I closed the thread without typing, because the answer would not be typed, and it would not be argued, and it would not be softened. It would be delivered in the move I had been holding for years. The one that would turn their question into an echo, the one they would not see coming until it was already done. By the time their messages shifted from outrage to bargaining and then to that familiar family chorus about how I had misunderstood love and should come home so we could talk like adults, the last piece of my plan was already moving on rails I had set weeks ago when I realized that a conversation in our house always meant I would be appointed chair, moderator, and cleanup crew while the verdict remained unchanged. So instead of another round of group therapy that would end with me carrying the groceries and the guilt, I chose the language they always respected more than mine, which is the language of contracts, signatures, and keys that either open or do not. What they never noticed, because noticing would have required them to treat me as the center of gravity instead of the floor beneath it, was that the lease for the place they called the family home did not float on some invisible community credit line. It lived under my name alone because years ago I was the only one who qualified without a cosigner, and I had kept it that way through renewals and inspections and emergency repairs paid on my card with the quiet understanding that stability was my job. And when I filed a notice of non-renewal with the property manager a month before their trip, I did it without fanfare or malice. I did it the way you put down a weight you are no longer able or willing to lift. And I set the move-out inspection for the first business day after their return, knowing that any continuation beyond that date would require a new application from the remaining occupants and an approval based on their credit and income rather than the elastic grace of mine. The knock on their door that afternoon was not mine, and it was not drama. It was the property manager with a clipboard and a neutral tone asking for the designated leaseholder. And when my mother tried to answer on my behalf, as she has answered on my behalf since childhood, the manager politely explained that the leaseholder had already surrendered her keys and completed her portion of the exit, that the unit would revert to vacancy unless a new agreement was executed within the posted window, and that the posted window was short because my notice had been filed within the proper time frame, which is another way of saying that adults in this country understand deadlines better than they understand hurt feelings. And in that moment, the house where I had been cast as the eternal assistant turned into a set of rooms with rules they could not charm or scold into bending. I did not need to witness my sister's face when she put these pieces together with the other letter on the table, the one from her lender confirming that the cosign release was in motion and contingent only on her own requalification, because I already knew the texture of her panic from years of bailing her out of late fees and temporary gaps between jobs, and I also knew the way my father would try to turn the clock back by calling in favors, and how my mother would pivot from injured to indignant and back again in the time it takes to refresh a screen. But none of those performances would unlock a deadbolt or impress an underwriter, and for once their outcomes would live where they belonged, in their hands. At noon, a courier I had hired weeks ago on a simple contract that asked for nothing but punctuality dropped a slim folder at their door with 3 things inside. Not a speech and not a manifesto, but the adult equivalents of both. The first being a notarized affidavit itemizing the accounts and services I had funded and the dates they had been terminated or transferred, with copies of confirmations attached so there would be no mythology about me sabotaging the family. The second being a clean ledger showing the exact distribution of the emergency fund and the precise amount that went to me based on deposits documented over the years, so that anyone who could read could also shut up. And the third being a short letter on a lawyer's letterhead, yes, mine, paid for by me, because I am done arguing in kitchens, stating that any contact moving forward would be routed through counsel for matters related to debts, guarantees, or slander, and all personal contact would be considered on a case-by-case basis that did not include midnight pleas for me to fix the internet or the thermostat or the latest fire disguised as an opportunity. When my phone buzzed with a new thread spun up to bypass the old one I had muted, I let it ring into the quiet and then die, because everything that mattered had already been said in the only syntax that ever mattered to them. And I sat on the floor of my small apartment, the one I signed for without asking permission, the one with a lease that lists only my name, and I listened to the kind of silence that is not punishment but relief. The kind that belongs to people who finally made a choice and intend to live with it, and I opened a notebook that did not hold inventories or proof or strategies, and I wrote a single line I could keep, which said that I did not disappear. I simply moved into a life where I am visible, and that if they ever want to see me, they will have to walk into it without maps I drew for them. In the evening, when the property manager called to confirm that the inspection had been completed for my portion and that the remaining residents would need to decide whether to apply on their own or vacate by the posted date, I thanked her for the clarity that had been missing from my life for far too long, and I set a delayed message to deliver to the family thread at exactly the hour when they liked to post their happiest photos. A single paragraph that was not an apology and not a threat, but a mirror, telling them that they were right when they said I did not need a break, because breaks are temporary and depend on someone else deciding you deserve rest, while freedom is permanent and only you can grant it to yourself. And that I had finally granted it, and that if they wanted something from me now they would have to offer something back that resembled respect, not a seat at the kids' table with a chore list and the promise of next time. They will tell stories about me for a while, I am sure, stories about betrayal and coldness and overreaction, because people who benefit from your self-erasure always call your reappearance an attack. Yet the truth lives in the paper trail they cannot shred and in the rooms they must pay for or leave, and if a part of me aches when I think of birthdays and holidays and the easy shorthand of shared history, another part of me finally exhales, because I know that the person who always fixed the mess is not walking back through that door, and that the home they walked into where I no longer existed was not a stunt but a statement, the final move in a plan I should have made years ago. And when I lock my door at night and the quiet folds over me, I do not wonder whether I went too far. I think about how far I went for them and how long, and I say, not out loud but with my whole life, that this was epic enough.